37,000 feet above ground, and Derek had never felt more alone. His 8-month-old daughter Rosie was screaming, that raw, desperate kind of cry that makes strangers stare and mothers look away. Sweat dripped down his temple. His hands shook. Every passenger in row 12 through 18 was glaring, whispering, judging. A man in a business suit muttered something about controlling your kid. A flight attendant approached with that tight smile that meant trouble. Derek closed his eyes, pulled Rosie closer, and whispered the only words he knew. "I'm sorry, baby. Daddy's trying." Then she appeared. A woman from the row across stood up without a word. She didn't ask permission. She simply reached out, lifted Rosie from his trembling arms, and did something no stranger should ever do. The cabin went silent. Derek's heart stopped, and what happened next would haunt him for 8 months, until he finally understood why she did it. The red-eye flight from Chicago to Seattle was supposed to be simple. Derek had planned everything down to the minute. The feeding schedule, the diaper bag packed with military precision, the white noise app downloaded on his phone. He had read every article, watched every video, asked every single dad in his support group for advice. 8 months of solo parenting had taught him that preparation was the only thing standing between him and complete disaster. But Rosie had other plans. She started fussing somewhere over Nebraska. By the time they crossed into Wyoming airspace, the fussing had turned into full-blown wailing. Derek tried the bottle. She pushed it away. He tried the pacifier. She spat it out. He tried rocking, bouncing, humming every lullaby he could remember from his own childhood. Nothing worked. The crying only got louder, more urgent, as if Rosie was trying to tell him something he couldn't understand. Derek felt the familiar weight of shame pressing down on his chest. He knew what the other passengers were thinking. He could see it in the way the woman in front of him kept sighing dramatically, in the way the elderly couple across the aisle exchanged knowing glances. They were thinking what everyone always thought when they saw him alone with Rosie, that he was doing it wrong, that he didn't know what he was doing, that a baby needed her mother, and he was just a poor substitute trying his best. They weren't entirely wrong. 8 months ago, Derek had no idea how to change a diaper. 8 months ago, he couldn't tell the difference between a hungry cry and a tired cry. 8 months ago, his wife Madison was supposed to be here, doing all the things that seemed to come so naturally to mothers. But Madison had held Rosie exactly once, for 37 seconds in the delivery room, before the hemorrhaging started. Before the doctor stopped smiling. Before Derek's entire world collapsed into a single devastating sentence. We did everything we could. Now here he was, alone on a plane with a screaming baby and no idea what to do next. The flight attendant was making her way down the aisle, that practiced smile fixed on her face like a warning. Derek braced himself for the lecture, the thinly veiled suggestion that maybe he should consider taking Rosie to the back of the plane, away from the paying customers who didn't sign up for this. That's when the woman stood up. She was sitting in the row across from him, window seat, and Derek hadn't noticed her until that moment. She had dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and tired eyes that suggested she hadn't slept in days. There was a little girl curled up beside her, maybe 4 years old, fast asleep against the window with a stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. The woman didn't look at Derek. She didn't ask if he needed help. She simply stood, crossed the narrow aisle, and held out her arms. "Give her to me," she said. It wasn't a question. Derek's first instinct was to refuse. Strangers didn't just take other people's babies. That wasn't how the world worked. But something in her voice, a quiet authority that seemed to come from a place deeper than politeness, made him hesitate. And in that moment of hesitation, the woman reached down and lifted Rosie from his arms as if it was the most natural thing in the world. The cabin fell silent. Even the man in the business suit stopped his irritated muttering. Everyone watched as this stranger cradled Derek's daughter against her chest and began to hum, low and soft, a melody that sounded like something between a lullaby and a prayer. She swayed gently from side to side, her eyes closed, her lips moving as if she was having a conversation with Rosie that no one else could hear. And then, impossibly, Rosie stopped crying. Not gradually, not in fits and starts, but all at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. She let out one last, shuddering sob, then nestled her face into the woman's neck and went still. Derek watched in stunned disbelief as his daughter's tiny fingers curled around a strand of dark hair, holding on as if she had found something she had been searching for all along. The woman opened her eyes and looked at Derek. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said, very quietly, "She just wanted to be held by someone who wasn't afraid." Derek didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't sure there was anything to say. So he just sat there, watching this stranger rock his daughter to sleep, and wondered how she could possibly know what Rosie needed when he, her own father, had been failing for the past 3 hours. The flight attendant had stopped in the middle of the aisle, her rehearsed speech dying on her lips. She blinked a few times, then retreated back toward the galley as if she had witnessed something too intimate to interrupt. The other passengers slowly returned to their books and phones and in-flight movies, the tension draining from the cabin like air from a balloon. "I'm Cassidy," the woman said, settling into the empty seat beside Derek. Rosie was already asleep, her breathing slow and even against Cassidy's collarbone. "And before you ask, no, I'm not some baby whisperer. I just remember what it feels like." What feels like?" Derek asked. Cassidy's eyes drifted to the window, where the darkness outside was just beginning to show the first hints of dawn. Being so tired that you can't see straight, feeling like everyone is watching you fail, wondering if you're ever going to figure out how to do this. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I spent the first year of my daughter's life convinced that I was the worst mother in the world. Turns out I was just the only one trying." Derek glanced at the little girl still sleeping in the window seat across the aisle. She had Cassidy's dark hair, but her face was softer, rounder, with the kind of peaceful expression that only children can manage in sleep. "Her father?" he asked, then immediately regretted it. "Sorry, that's none of my business." "It's fine," Cassidy said, though something in her jaw tightened. "He left when Hazel was 6 months old. Said he wasn't ready to be a dad. Funny how they figure that out after the hard part is supposed to start getting easier." She let out a small, humorless laugh. "My mom was the only one who helped me. She moved in, took care of Hazel while I worked, held me together when I was falling apart." Cassidy's voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she looked away. "She died last week. Heart attack. No warning, no goodbye, just gone. This flight is us coming home from the funeral." Derek felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went beyond sympathy. He knew that kind of loss. He lived with it every single day. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it in a way he hadn't meant anything in a long time. "My wife died giving birth to Rosie. She never got to hold her. Not really. Just once, for a few seconds, and then—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He had never been able to finish that sentence. Cassidy turned to look at him, and for the first time, Derek saw the full weight of exhaustion in her eyes. Not just the tiredness of a long flight or a sleepless night, but something deeper, the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying grief alone for so long that you forget what it feels like to put it down. "So we're both doing this by ourselves," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," Derek said. "I guess we are." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky lighten outside the window. Rosie slept on, her small body rising and falling with each breath, completely unaware of the 2 broken people who were holding her up. Across the aisle, Hazel stirred in her sleep, mumbling something about butterflies before settling back into her dreams. "She talked about you," Cassidy said suddenly. Derek frowned. "Who?" "Rosie." "Well, not talked, obviously. But when I was holding her, she kept looking at you. Even when she was crying, she was looking at you, like she was making sure you were still there." Cassidy shifted Rosie slightly, and the baby let out a contented sigh. "She's not crying because you're doing something wrong, Derek. She's crying because she knows how hard you're trying. Babies can feel that, you know. The fear, the love, all of it." Derek felt something hot and unexpected burning behind his eyes. He blinked rapidly, turning toward the window so Cassidy wouldn't see. "My wife," he said, his voice rough. "She said something to me right before. Right at the end. She said, 'Find someone who loves her, like you love me.' I thought she was talking about Rosie, about finding someone to help raise her. But now, I think—" He stopped, unable to continue. "Now you think what?" Cassidy asked gently. Derek shook his head. "I don't know. I don't know what I think anymore." The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that they were beginning their descent into Seattle. The cabin lights flickered on, and passengers began stirring, gathering their belongings, preparing for landing. Across the aisle, Hazel's eyes fluttered open, and she sat up with the instant alertness that only children possess. "Mommy," she called out, her voice still thick with sleep. Then she saw Derek and Rosie, and her eyes went wide. "Mommy, there's a baby." Cassidy smiled, the first real smile Derek had seen from her. "I know, sweetheart. This is Rosie. And this is her daddy, Derek." Hazel studied Derek with the serious intensity of a 4-year-old making an important assessment. "Why is he sad?" she asked. "He's not sad, baby. He's just tired." "Like us." Hazel considered this for a moment, then nodded as if it made perfect sense. "My grandma went to heaven," she announced to Derek. "Mommy says she's watching us from the clouds. Do you think she can see the plane?" Derek felt his throat tighten. "I think she can see everything," he said. "I think she's probably really proud of you and your mommy." Hazel beamed, apparently satisfied with this answer. Then she pointed at Rosie, who was starting to stir in Cassidy's arms. "Is the baby going to cry again?" "I don't think so," Cassidy said, looking at Derek. "I think she found what she needed." The plane touched down with a gentle bump, and the cabin erupted into the usual chaos of deplaning. People standing before the seatbelt sign was off, yanking bags from overhead compartments, jostling for position in the aisle. Derek reached for Rosie, and Cassidy handed her over carefully, their fingers brushing in the transfer. "Thank you," Derek said. The words felt inadequate for what had just happened, but he didn't know what else to say. "I don't know how to— I mean, you didn't have to." "I know," Cassidy said. She was already gathering Hazel's things, stuffing the rabbit back into a small backpack, moving with the efficient motions of a mother who had done this 1,000 times. "But I wanted to, and sometimes that's enough." Hazel tugged at Derek's sleeve. "Are you coming to our house?" she asked. "I have toys. I can show the baby my toys." Derek looked at Cassidy, expecting her to gently redirect her daughter's invitation. Instead, she paused, her hand on the back of the seat in front of her, and met his eyes. "I'm not ready," she said quietly. "For whatever this is, whatever it could be. I just buried my mother, and I'm barely holding it together. And I don't know if I can—" "I understand," Derek said quickly. "I wasn't expecting—" "But," Cassidy continued, as if he hadn't spoken, "I work at a café, Rosewood Café, on Maple Street. Hazel and I are there most mornings. If you ever want to—" She trailed off, then reached into her bag and pulled out a receipt, scribbling an address on the back. "No pressure, no expectations. Just, if you want to. Derek took the paper, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his pocket. Rosewood Café, he repeated. Maple Street. Mommy makes the best hot chocolate, Hazel added helpfully, with extra marshmallows. The line was finally moving, passengers shuffling toward the exit. Cassidy picked up Hazel and stepped into the aisle, then turned back one last time. She's beautiful, Derek. Rosie. She's really, really beautiful. Cassidy's voice caught slightly. And she's lucky to have you, even if it doesn't feel like that right now. Then she was gone, disappearing into the stream of passengers, Hazel's sleepy face peering over her shoulder, until they turned the corner and vanished from sight. Derek stood there for a long moment, Rosie warm and solid in his arms, the piece of paper burning a hole in his pocket. The man in the business suit pushed past him with an impatient grunt, but Derek barely noticed. He was thinking about Madison, about her last words, about the way Rosie had stopped crying the moment a stranger held her. He was thinking about grief and exhaustion and the impossible weight of doing everything alone. And he was thinking about a little girl who wanted to show Rosie her toys, and a woman with tired eyes who remembered what it felt like. The months that followed were both endless and impossibly fast. Derek went back to work, back to the routine of daycare drop-offs and late-night feedings and weekend trips to the park, where other parents smiled at him with that particular mix of pity and admiration reserved for single fathers. He got better at the practical things, the bottle temperatures, the sleep schedules, the art of grocery shopping with a baby strapped to his chest. But the loneliness didn't fade. If anything, it grew deeper. Settling into the quiet moments when Rosie was asleep and the apartment was too still, and Derek found himself staring at Madison's photo on the mantel, wondering what she would think of the father he was becoming. He kept the receipt in his wallet. He took it out sometimes, late at night, tracing the handwritten letters with his thumb. Rosewood Café, Maple Street. Some mornings, he would put Rosie in her car seat and drive toward that part of town, telling himself he was just exploring, just getting to know the neighborhood. He would park across the street from a small cafe with a green awning and flower boxes in the windows, and he would watch families come and go, couples sharing pastries, mothers meeting for coffee while their children played. He never went inside. 8 months passed. Rosie learned to crawl, then to pull herself up on furniture, then to take her first wobbly steps across the living room into Derek's waiting arms. She learned to say "dada" and "no" and more, her vocabulary expanding with each passing week. She was becoming a person, a real person with preferences and opinions, and a laugh that sounded like bells, and Derek loved her so fiercely that sometimes it hurt to breathe. But there were nights when she would cry inconsolably, and nothing Derek did could calm her down. On those nights, he would hold her and rock her, and whisper the same words he had whispered on the plane. "I'm sorry, baby. Daddy's trying." And sometimes, in the darkest hours, he would think about a stranger who had held his daughter for 20 minutes and done what he couldn't do in 20 hours. He thought about that night more than he wanted to admit. He thought about Cassidy's tired eyes, and Hazel's serious questions, and the way the cabin had gone silent when Rosie stopped crying. He thought about the way Cassidy had said, "She just wanted to be held by someone who wasn't afraid," and wondered if she was right. He thought about her every time he passed a mother and daughter in the grocery store, every time he saw a woman with dark hair and a messy ponytail, every time Rosie reached for someone who wasn't him. On the morning of Rosie's first birthday, Derek woke up before dawn. He lay in bed for a long time, listening to Rosie babble in her crib through the baby monitor, and made a decision. He got up, showered, dressed Rosie in her nicest outfit, a yellow dress with little daisies that Madison's mother had sent, and drove across town to Maple Street. The café was exactly as he remembered it, from all those times he had watched from across the street. Green awning, flower boxes, a small chalkboard sign out front advertising the daily special. Through the window, he could see mismatched tables and chairs, local art on the walls, the kind of cozy warmth that made you want to stay for hours. And there, behind the counter, was Cassidy. Her hair was longer now, pulled back in a loose braid, and she was wearing an apron dusted with flour. She was laughing at something the elderly man at the register had said, her whole face transformed by the smile, and Derek felt his heart do something strange and unfamiliar in his chest. He almost turned around. He almost got back in the car and drove home and convinced himself that this was a stupid idea, that 8 months was too long, that she wouldn't remember him, that he was being ridiculous. But then Rosie made a sound, not a cry, not a laugh, just a small, curious noise. And Derek looked down at his daughter. "What do you think?" he asked her. "Should we go in?" Rosie blinked at him with Madison's eyes and said very clearly, "More." Derek laughed, a real laugh, the kind he hadn't heard from himself in months. "Okay," he said. "Okay, Rosie. More it is." He pushed open the door. A small bell chimed overhead, and the smell of coffee and fresh bread washed over him. The cafe was half full with the morning crowd, people on laptops, couples sharing breakfast, an older woman reading a newspaper in the corner. No one looked up as Derek walked in, except for one person. In the far corner, at a small table by the window, sat a little girl with dark, curly hair. She was bent over a piece of paper, coloring intently with a crayon, her tongue sticking out in concentration. Next to her was an empty chair with a stuffed rabbit propped against the back. Derek recognized her immediately. She was bigger now, older, but she had the same serious expression, the same careful way of holding her crayon. Hazel. As if sensing his gaze, Hazel looked up. Her eyes went wide. Then she let out a shriek that made every head in the cafe turn. "Mommy! Mommy! It's the airplane man! The airplane man with baby Rosie!" Cassidy nearly dropped the coffee pot she was holding. She spun around, her eyes scanning the cafe until they found Derek standing by the door. Rosie in his arms, looking like he wasn't sure whether to run or stay. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Rosie wiggled in Derek's arms, pointing toward Cassidy with one chubby finger, and made a sound that Derek had never heard her make before. "Ma," she said. "Ma, ma, ma." Derek felt the blood drain from his face. "Rosie, no, that's not." But Cassidy was already moving. She set down the coffee pot, came around the counter, and walked toward them with tears streaming down her face. Hazel had jumped out of her chair and was running too, her drawing forgotten, her rabbit abandoned. "You came," Cassidy said, stopping just a few feet away. Her voice was shaking. I didn't think I wasn't going to," Derek admitted. "I almost didn't. About 100 times I almost didn't." "Then why did you?" Derek looked at Rosie, who was still reaching for Cassidy, still making that sound. Ma, 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 like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Because she hasn't stopped talking about you," he said. "I mean, not talking, obviously. But every night before she falls asleep, she makes this sound, this humming sound, and it took me weeks to figure out where I'd heard it before." He paused, his throat tight. "It was the song you sang to her, on the plane. She remembered." Cassidy's hand flew to her mouth. "That was my mother's lullaby," she whispered. "She used to sing it to me when I was little. I didn't even realize I was—" "She remembered," Derek said again, "and so did I." Hazel had reached them by now, bouncing on her toes with barely contained excitement. "Is baby Rosie going to play with my toys now? I told her she could. Remember, Mommy?" "I told her on the airplane." Cassidy laughed, a wet, wonderful sound, and bent down to her daughter's level. I remember, sweetheart. Why don't you show her the corner where we keep the crayons? Rosie might like to draw." Hazel's face lit up like Christmas morning. She looked at Derek hopefully. "Can I hold her hand? Please. I'll be really careful." Derek set Rosie down on her feet. She was steady now, had been walking for 2 months, though she still preferred to hold on to something. A table edge, a pant leg, a finger. She looked up at Hazel with wide, curious eyes. "Hi, Rosie," Hazel said solemnly, extending her small hand. "I'm Hazel. We're going to be best friends." Rosie studied the offered hand for a moment. Then she reached out and grabbed Hazel's fingers, and the two of them toddled off toward the corner table. Hazel chattering about all the important things Rosie needed to know about crayons and coloring and the best way to draw a butterfly. Derek and Cassidy stood there, watching them go, standing close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. "She called you Mama," Cassidy said softly. "I know. I'm sorry. She doesn't really understand." "Don't apologize." Cassidy's voice was firm, but there was something underneath it, something fragile and hopeful and terrifying all at once. "My mother used to say that children know things that adults are too scared to see." She turned to look at Derek, really look at him, and he saw that she was crying again, but smiling too. Maybe she sees something we're not ready to admit yet. Derek felt the ground shift under his feet. "What are you saying?" Cassidy took a breath. "I'm saying that for 8 months, I've been thinking about a man on an airplane, a man who was so clearly terrified and exhausted and in over his head, but who was also holding his daughter like she was the most precious thing in the universe. I'm saying that I've been thinking about how he looked at me when I sang her to sleep, like I had done something miraculous, when really I just remembered what it felt like to need help and be too proud to ask for it." She stepped closer, close enough that Derek could smell coffee and flour and something that might have been vanilla. "I'm saying that Hazel asks about you every single day. She draws pictures of the airplane man and baby Rosie. She put them up on the wall in her bedroom, and every time I see them, I wonder what would have happened if I'd been braver. If I had given you my number instead of just an address, if I had trusted that whatever I was feeling on that plane wasn't just grief and exhaustion, but something real. Cassidy, I'm not done." She was crying harder now, but her voice was steady. "I'm saying that my mother died, never knowing if I would find someone. She used to tell me that good men are the ones who stay, not the ones who make promises, not the ones who say the right things, but the ones who stay, even when it's hard, even when they're scared, even when they don't know what they're doing. She said I'd know one when I found him, because he'd be the one who was already doing the hard things alone." She reached up and touched Derek's face, her palm warm against his cheek. "You stayed," she said. "For 8 months, you've been doing this alone, and you stayed. For your daughter, for Madison, for yourself, and now you're here, and my daughter is teaching your daughter how to draw butterflies, and I don't know what happens next. But I know." "What?" Derek managed. "What do you know?" "I know that when you walked through that door, I finally understood what my mother meant, about good men, about staying." She smiled through her tears. "I know that I don't want to do this alone anymore, and I don't think you do either." Derek felt something break open inside him. Not a wound, but a wall. A wall he had built 8 months ago in a hospital room, brick by brick. Every time someone told him he was doing great. Every time someone said Madison would be proud. Every time someone looked at him with pity and called him brave. He had built that wall to protect himself, to keep the grief contained, to make sure that no one could ever hurt him the way losing Madison had hurt him. But standing here, in this tiny café on Maple Street, with this woman who had held his daughter on an airplane and sung her a lullaby, and somehow remembered what it felt like, the wall didn't seem so important anymore. I don't know how to do this, he said. His voice cracked on the last word. I don't know how to be. I don't know if I can. Neither do I, Cassidy said. But maybe we can figure it out together. One day at a time, one cup of coffee at a time. She glanced at the corner, where Hazel and Rosie were now both covered in crayon, giggling at something only they understood. One butterfly drawing at a time. Derek followed her gaze, watching his daughter laugh with pure, uncomplicated joy. Rosie looked up and caught him watching. And she waved, a clumsy, full-arm wave that nearly knocked the crayon out of Hazel's hand. "Dada," she called out. "Dada, look." "I see, baby," Derek called back. "I see." The elderly man behind the counter, the cafe owner, Derek would later learn, a man named George who had known Cassidy's mother for 40 years, cleared his throat loudly. "Hey, Cass," he called out. "You gonna introduce me to your young man? Or should I just keep pretending I'm not watching this whole thing like my favorite soap opera?" Cassidy laughed, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "George, this is Derek. Derek, this is George. He's going to give you a free coffee and a muffin because he's a romantic, and he's been waiting for this moment since I told him about the airplane." George snorted. "I'm giving him free coffee because anyone who makes you smile like that deserves at least that much." He looked at Derek with eyes that had seen a lot of years and a lot of stories. "Blueberry or chocolate chip?" "Chocolate chip," Derek said automatically. "Good answer. Cass, take your break. I'll handle the counter." Cassidy led Derek to a small table near the window, across from where Hazel and Rosie were still creating their masterpiece. The morning sunlight streamed through the glass, catching the dust motes floating in the air, making everything look softer and more golden than it had any right to be. "This is where my mom used to sit," Cassidy said, running her hand over the worn wood of the table. "Every morning, for 20 years, she sat right here with her tea and her crossword puzzle. George keeps the table reserved for her. Even now. Old habits, he says." Derek looked at the empty chair across from him, and suddenly he understood. This table wasn't just a table. It was a shrine, a memory, a promise. It was a place where love had lived and continued to live, even after the person was gone. "What was her name?" he asked. "Ruth. Ruth Ellen Foster." Cassidy smiled at the name, and there was no sadness in it, just love, just gratitude, just the quiet peace of someone who had learned to carry grief without being crushed by it. "She would have liked you. She would have said you have honest eyes." "Do I? The most honest I've ever seen." George appeared with 2 coffees and 2 enormous chocolate chip muffins. He set them down without comment, then retreated back to the counter with a knowing wink at Cassidy. "So," Cassidy said, wrapping her hands around her mug. "What happens now?" Derek looked at her across the table. This woman who had stepped into his life for 20 minutes on an airplane and somehow changed everything. He looked at the little girls in the corner, already inseparable after 10 minutes, their heads bent together over a shared piece of paper. He looked at the empty chair where Ruth Ellen Foster used to sit, and thought about Madison, and thought about the way grief and love were sometimes the same thing, just wearing different clothes. "Now," he said slowly, "I think I'd like to hear about Ruth, and maybe you'd like to hear about Madison, and maybe, if it's okay with you, I'd like to come back tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. Until those girls over there are so sick of each other that they're fighting over crayons instead of sharing them." Cassidy laughed, that wet, wonderful sound again. "That might take a while. Hazel's pretty stubborn. Good thing I'm not going anywhere." Outside the window, the sun continued to rise. Inside the cafe, 2 broken people sat across from each other and began, slowly, carefully, to tell each other their stories. In the corner, a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old created a drawing that would later be framed and hung on a wall in a house that didn't exist yet. A house with a green door and a backyard, with a swing set and a kitchen that always smelled like coffee and fresh bread. But that was later. Right now, there was just this: 2 cups of coffee, 2 chocolate chip muffins, and the sound of children laughing. Right now, there was just Cassidy's hand reaching across the table and Derek's hand meeting her halfway, their fingers intertwining like they had always been meant to fit together. Right now, there was just a single dad and a single mom, both of them tired, both of them scared, both of them hoping that maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't have to do this alone anymore. And in the corner, Rosie looked up from her drawing, saw her father holding hands with the woman from the airplane, and smiled. It was a smile that looked exactly like Madison's smile, that smile that Derek had been so afraid of losing. But he realized now that he hadn't lost it at all. He had just been waiting for the right moment to see it again. "Dada," Rosie said, pointing at her drawing. "Look. Family." Derek looked at the paper, a chaotic mess of color that might have been 4 stick figures if you squinted hard enough. He looked at Hazel, who was nodding proudly at her collaborative work. He looked at Cassidy, who was crying again, but smiling too. "Yeah, Rosie," he said, his voice thick with something that felt like hope. "Family." George watched from behind the counter, wiping down the same spot he had been wiping for the last 10 minutes. He thought about Ruth Ellen Foster, about the way she used to sit at that table every morning and tell him that someday her Cassidy would find her person. "Took your time, didn't you?" he murmured to the ceiling, to the clouds, to wherever Ruth was watching from. "But I guess you always did have a flair for the dramatic." Somewhere far above, on a plane crossing the same sky that Derek and Cassidy had crossed 8 months ago, a baby started crying. The mother looked around apologetically, already bracing for the judgmental stares. But the woman in the seat next to her just smiled and held out her arms. "May I?" she asked. And the cycle continued, strangers becoming helpers, helpers becoming friends, friends becoming family. One crying baby at a time, one act of unexpected kindness at a time, one moment of courage at a time. Because sometimes the unthinkable isn't something terrible. Sometimes the unthinkable is simply this: a stranger who sees your struggle and chooses to help. A hand reaching out across an aisle, a lullaby remembered from childhood, a piece of paper with an address scribbled on the back. Sometimes the unthinkable is love, arriving when you least expect it, in the form you least expect, from the person you would never have thought to look for. And sometimes all it takes is a baby who won't stop crying, and a single mother who does the unthinkable.